As our guest and our panel for today, I'm going to start to my immediate left. We have with us Dean Kalia Williams, who is Associate Dean of Worship and Spiritual Formation, Associate Professor in the Practice of Worship, and Co-Director of Candler's Baptist Studies Program. She is an ordained minister in the Christian Church or Disciples of Christ and American Baptist Churches USA, and currently serves as an associate minister at Providence Missionary Baptist Church in Atlanta. Welcome, Dean Williams. We also have with us, to her left, Reverend Nick Peterson, who is our visiting instructor of preaching and a doctoral student in practical theology in Emory's Graduate Division of Religion, with his research exploring Black faith and Black care as responses to an anti-Black world. An ordained elder in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, he serves as assistant pastor at New Bethel AME Church in Lithonia. Welcome, Reverend Nick Peterson. And to his left, we have Dr. Jonathan Cavillo, who is the Associate Professor of Latinx Communities. His work examines how distinct Latinx populations build communities of belonging through faith and creativity, often in the face of systemic exclusion. Welcome, Dr. Cavillo. And to his left, we have Dr. Kwak Pilang. She is the Dean's Professor of Systematic Theology, a pioneer in Asian and Asian American feminist theology and post-colonial theology. She published an essay on post-colonial preaching in her most recent book, Post-Colonial Politics and Theology. Let's welcome Dr. Kwak. And to her left is Dean Smith, who is the Charles Howard Candler Professor of Divinity and Associate Dean of Faculty. Ordained to ministry in the Presbyterian Church USA, Dean Smith served as pastor to 2 small membership churches in rural New York prior to his doctoral studies. Let's also welcome Dean Smith. All right. So I've already kind of joked with a couple of the panelists that the code word is pineapple if we ask a question that's too deep. But I want to just begin by grounding us in terms of our question for today, some opening questions, and we're hoping that each person will take 2 to 3 minutes to explore the answer to this question. And we're going to start actually with Dean Williams. I do love you. You don't. But we're going to start on my left and work our way down to the end. And these opening questions are, what is one hallmark of your primary preaching context? And what is considered, quote unquote, good preaching where you are? I'll say that again. What is one hallmark of your primary preaching context? And what is considered, quote unquote, good preaching where you are?
Mm-hmm. So I will preface by saying, as Shanice mentioned, I am an associate minister at Providence Missionary Baptist Church, so that would be sort of my primary context. I get to preach a lot of different places by way of my role here as well, but I'll focus in on Providence. Providence is a historic Baptist church here in Atlanta, and I will say one of the hallmarks of the preaching context is we have historically, throughout Providence's history, had the amazing benefit of having great preachers, and this goes all the way back, having great preachers who are rooted in the community. And so one of the hallmarks is you don't hear a sermon that's disconnected from who we are within our community. It's very much connected to what's happening socially around us in the Cascade area, also what's happening socially in Greater Atlanta and within our country. But I would say definitely you will always hear and feel a connection there. What is good preaching? That is the question. I mean, if you ask me, my answer might be different from those in my congregational context, but good preaching at Providence is definitely preaching that is exegetically sound and preaching that is aware of who is sitting in the pews. And I say that because our pastor, I'm married to the pastor, so my husband, seminary trained. We are both trained from Presbyterian seminary, so we did a lot of work with Hebrew and with Greek and with exegesis, and you do all of that, and that work happens and shows up, but it doesn't take over the sermon, because then it will be over the people's heads. And so I think the good preaching is being able to take all of that work and then distilling it into a sermon that anyone who's hearing can actually connect with and relate to. And I do think that's a mark of good preaching in our context.
All right, thank you so much. Reverend Peterson.
Excellent. So the community that I'm serving is on the border between Gwinnett and DeKalb counties along Yellow River. And the church grew out of a formerly enslaved community that was on a plantation called Promised Land. The black folk eventually bought the land and built a family. So there's several families that have long history with the church. But the church sort of stays in this kind of liminal, right? This kind of liminal space, an in-between on the steps, right? Between two floors. And to that end, the community is made up of people who have moved to the area, like myself, as well as people who have lived in the area for quite some time. It's intergenerational, right? So we have great-grandparents who come to church regularly with their children, their grandchildren, and now their great-grandchildren. So a hallmark is really speaking to a context that's highly diverse within itself, but that distinctly understands itself as a black community, and wanting to be in a context that recognizes the range of challenges that attend black folk regardless of class position, right? And so whether you are the attorney or the academician, or if you are just trying to figure out how you're gonna pay your water bill, all of those positions have to be tended to regularly on a Sunday basis. So what that means for good preaching in our context is good preaching is pastoral. I am not in a revivalist church where every Sunday, you shout the people, and you come back next Sunday, you shout the people, and you come back next Sunday, and you shout the people. By pastoral, it's a slow burn, which is to say that you can work things out over 5, 6, 7, 8 weeks across a range of biblical texts, and that you tend to do small, humble things in the sermon. So the sermons don't necessarily have to land as dramatic or, after today, everything in your life will be changed. But they become sort of, openings. And I think the congregation is attuned to that as good preaching. So when outsiders come who are not pastors, but who sort of come with a revivalist intention, our congregation is like, So their sense of good preaching would definitely be a recognition of a pastoral kind of comportment in the preaching.
Thank you so much. Dr. Tanvi.
Great. Well, first of all, in terms of the context that I'm going to speak to, so I was a pastor of a community-based congregation, and this was located in Southern California in a predominantly Mexican-American neighborhood. The congregation itself was somewhat ethnically diverse, predominantly leaning into the demographic of the surrounding community, but also in some ways there was a class diversity and generational in terms of from the community. It was predominantly first-generation immigrant, and then we had other young people, young adults, in particular young families, that wanted to be a part of the community to serve. And some of them had more education. They had, college degrees, masters, even PhD in one case. And so it was speaking to this very diverse audience where I had some folks in the crowd that were literally adults learning to read. And then I had adults with, masters and PhDs. So I'm actually going to speak to a particular tension that was a hallmark in this particular context. And so often in Latinx context, people talk about like linguistic differences, English versus Spanish, or in some cases Portuguese. But for me, what I noticed is that, yes, that linguistic difference was there, but there was also a very different expectation. And it was mostly generational, around questions of certainty and authority. So there was an expectation that the pastor should, from the first generation, let me say that, first generation immigrant half of the church, there was an expectation that the pastor would preach with authority, that the pastor would speak in a very directive way, that the pastor would tell the community what needed to be done. And they saw that as a sign that the pastor was anointed, that the pastor was called, that the pastor had a strong relationship with God. The second and third generation that were present and were more diverse ethnically and had more education, interestingly enough, had an expectation that the pastor would be more open to conversation, that the sermon would contain space for mystery, for questions, and in some cases for literal questioning, that there would be an opportunity to ask questions of the speaker even. And so we did some of that. We were very experimental in our format at that time in this church that I led for about 10 years. And so sometimes we did experiment with opening up the time for questions, for discussion, for conversation, and that was built into the sermon. It was interesting navigating and negotiating across these differences within this context because folks loved each other, they cared about each other, they looked into each other's lives, but I must admit they had different expectations about what good preaching looked like, even in terms of the format and in terms of the sort of directive nature of what a sermon should be. So,
Thank you.
I am a lay leader of the Episcopal Church, so I am not a pastor. I do not have a context that I regularly preach. I had the opportunity of preaching at Canberra, both to the whole community and also to the Asian and Asian American community. And sometimes I was invited to preach at some of those churches because I know some of the students who I formerly taught, they are now pastors of churches. And so when you are a guest preacher, reading the room is really important. Just like today, I do not know many people who are participating in this wondrous Bendy conference. How to read the room, say what will be important. Then, I always say, in circumstances like this, you wait upon the Spirit. The Spirit was very active last night because before bed, I looked at the journal that I subscribe to, The Economist. And then, lo and behold, it talks about TikTok. Mind you, I am one half the Americans who have not downloaded the app. You might have downloaded. But then I read one sentence that captured my imagination. Nearly, the Americans spend 1 hour per day watching TikTok. Well, then as I was walking from the bus station to come to Canberra, what is the attraction of TikTok? And then now it has something to do with good preaching. I offer 2 words because I watched some of the TikTok videos, obviously. One is mundane, the other is relatable. Many of these videos do not talk about, wow, great philosophical concepts. did they eat? And then the clothes, and then but that is relatable. Many of us went to listen to Dr. Tom Long preaching. You know what I will never forget from that preaching was that when he said the word of God came to two women, Mary and Elizabeth. Not only two women with stretch marks. Did you hear that? So relatable. If we read the Romans correctly, we will come up with those mundane and relatable message, those nuggets that you never get for the glory of God.
Yeah. All right.
One of the first things I learned in reading the room, this was a number of years ago when Dr. Kwok first came here, that I didn't know how today was going to go, but I misread them because one of the fundamental things is you never follow Dr. Kwok. Never. I mean, it wasn't just that it was awesome, but it ended with the glory of God. Yeah. That's just a mic drop, call it a day kind of way. So anyway, I will work in the way, in whatever ways I can. I think that the question of context is complex for me now, as I think it is for many of us, in that I'm part of a congregation where I'm not the preacher. I'm part of most of the sermons that I hear are at Candler, not only from chapel, but hear 60 sermons in a semester. That'll add up. So this becomes a primary context for me, and then there's guest preaching. But I would say if there's a common thread across the institutions, the contexts where I often find myself, is that they are historically white institutions that are eager and not always sure how to become more diverse, not always doing that well or justly or completely, and that are still very much coming to consciousness or bringing to consciousness slavery and its still varying afterlives, and just what it means to be that kind of community, right? So places are in all that I preach are in all kinds of different spots along in those various journeys, but I think that's a commonality in a lot of the contexts that I know best. If I were to say something that is I see here, I'm going to speak more descriptively than prescriptively. That is, I'm not going to say what I think how you should preach in that context. That would be another question. But if I were to tell you the kind of preaching that I see elicits a strong response, I think it answers the question of identity on some level. Identity, it feels like to me right now, is one of these magic touchstones that when a sermon brushes against identity and can help people think about who they are, because that's the pressing, urgent question people bring so often, then you can feel the room come alive. And I think there's preachers do this especially, come to this touchstone, two different paths. There are more, but these two seem to me especially well trod. One of them is a mention or a reference to the kind of politics that can ground identity. So it's not just commentary on any public policy. If a preacher talks about quantitative easing, which I would say has actually had a huge effect on the global economy and on why people are rich and poor, that is not going to, I can see you're dead right now. Quantitative easing, don't talk to me about that, right? That's not the kind of politics, but that is politics, but that's not the kind of politics that's going to do it. But there are politics through which we make our identities, know our kinfolk, know our people, right, and know who we are. And when those kind of politics are mentioned, then the room comes alive, right? You can feel that. The second place that I think I see this happening around identity is it's always electric when there's a successful performance of authenticity. And by that I mean the showing in public, in the preacherly setting, of something that is usually public, but that is private. Another part of the self is brought into the pulpit. People are riveted by that. And I think it's because they want to know about this preacher's identity as they work on their own, just charged with significance. So politics and authenticity under that heading of these things contribute to identity. And I'd say, look, listen, think back to Tom Long's sermon yesterday. The stretch marks is good, but where two of the places people really came up, one were the references to the politics at the border. That's the kind of politics that can ground identity. But you could feel the room move on that. And then the talk back time. All back time questions were, tell us about the self behind the pulpit. There was such a desire from that room for that. And that wasn't in the sermon as much, right? There was a little bit of that. But the desire for it was strong, and it came out in the Q&A. So that kind of touching politics that can ground identity and displaying authenticity that speaks to the need for identity. That's what I see happening in my conference.
Thank you all. So these next round of questions is going to be more of a potpourri. So we won't necessarily go down the line. So we're just going to get in where we fit in, all right? And those of you maybe still eating your lunch, but still prayerfully think about your questions for our panelists. There's a mic on the left and a mic on the right, so you're able to ask your questions in between bites, all right? But I do want to ask an additional question. We're talking about preaching in different contexts, and so I'm going to merge a couple of questions that I had in mind. So in yesterday's Whitehead lecture, Dr. Jilts just did a masterful job in instructing us on this ethnographic charge to the preacher, right, about reading the room. And so my question is, because Dr. Jilts invoked the thought of mystic, theologian, and preacher Howard Thurman, and discussed the importance of us fulfilling our ethnographic charge to speak to those who have their backs against the wall. So what are the ways in which you actively and intentionally address the needs of the marginalized in your preaching and in your work? And as a section to that, what do you do to prepare to preach in a context that is very different than your own? So again, what are the ways in which you actively and intentionally address the needs of the marginalized in your preaching and in your work? And what do you do to prepare to preach in a context that is very different from your own? The floor is open.
One thing that came to mind, and because you oriented the question around that ethnographic task, and I'm actually teaching an ethnographic research course after this, so that's fresh in my mind. But one of the things that comes to mind is many of us work in or have worked in marginalized communities primarily. And so it may be easy to say, well, we're already speaking to folks on the margins just naturally. I mean, that's our own location, or that's part of our own identity. One of the things that I talk to my students about in doing ethnographic research, which I think applies to this question, I talk to them about, okay, identify the margins within the communities that you're studying. What are the margins within that community? And then look for the margins in the margins, because oftentimes there are people that we might say, well, this is a marginalized community, but often there are folks within that community which are on the edge. And so I think about in a sermon or in a conversation, whether it's conversational or whether it's a more traditional sermon, I think about, am I noticing and identifying the margins within the margins? Because yes, it is easy to say, well, I'm already speaking to the margins, but who are the folks that have been marginalized even in that community? And because often those are the folks that have something important to contribute also, and their voice isn't being heard. So part of it, my hope is, yeah, I may be the voice that's there because I'm preaching, but how am I amplifying the voice of those who are the margins of the margins?
Very good. Does anyone else want to?
So I'll say to the first question of actively addressing the needs of the marginalized. So I completely agree of, identifying who are on the margins within the marginalized. One of the things I think is important, especially in the community where I'm active in every week, right, is to sit with those needs. So really, I don't know the needs until I engage the people. I can't just be in the pulpit. I need to walk with people.
Yeah.
And so that's extremely important. Before a sermon is ever preached, do I know who you are? Do I know who the families are? Do I know who your children are? Do I know what you experienced over the last 3 months, 6 months, whatever it is? And then spending time with that, not in a way that says, I'm showing up as a pastoral figure, let me help you fix it. Let me help you pray it away. Let me just listen and be present in your context. That gives me a deeper understanding of what those needs are, and then prayerfully, as I'm in sermon preparation mode, those needs show up, but it's not just showing up in the content of the sermon.
Yeah.
It's also showing up in how it's delivered. And then I am, a person. So liturgically, what are we doing across the entire service that's starting to touch on the needs? Because the sermon can't do it all.
Right.
And so how are we helping people sing the faith that they need to hear and tap into in that moment? What's being heard in those moments of prayer? What's happening in the transition from one thing to another? Is there music that allows spirit to be felt in a particular way? And so thinking about it really broadly, but that for me comes out of an understanding of what that community needs. And so it's a little different if I'm going and I'm a guest preacher somewhere. I don't have that benefit. So even in the how do you prepare to preach, particularly in a context that's very different. I'm preparing to preach in Montreat in a few months. So that's a very different context than a historically Black Baptist context, right? And so it's learning a little bit, however I can, about the community that I'm going to, and then a whole lot of prayer.
Indeed.
In the preparation piece. And getting a sense from the minute I step foot on the grounds of what's the feel of the space. Feeling out how am I greeted, who do I see, structurally what does the building look like? That says a lot about the life of the congregation, right? Who's interacting, looking at the order of service, what does the flow look? That tells me a lot about tone that then in that moment might cause me to think about or rethink how the content that's been prepared gets delivered, or sometimes not, but just being fully aware of what those spaces call for.
Right. And you bring up a really great segue actually to one of my next questions about being sensitive liturgically. And so this next question is, in consideration of where we are on the liturgical calendar, we're approaching Palm Sunday and Resurrection Sunday, which are high holy days on the Christian calendar. And some of us, we approach, of course, this season with reverence or trepidation, depending on whether you're preaching that time. But in some traditions, one can expect individuals to show up for worship on this day who may not typically attend worship with this particular congregation. And so how are you reading the room and preparing to preach on this or occasion when you may not know who will show up in that room?
One thing I'd say is not to assume that the people who are there for that first time, or a first time in a long time, are not also people with their backs against the wall. To your last question, those groups can overlap significantly, and the needs are profound, or could be, right? So I think, and this loops back a little bit to the only Dean Williams' answer was so complete to the backs against the wall question, that it is listening, it is long-term listening, it is prayer. Solidarity is a slippery concept, but to the extent that that's possible. But here, and this is the piece that I would answer on the backs against the wall question that I think applies to the Palm Sunday and Easter Sunday question, it is to to preach always in a way that where the structure of the rhetoric and the structure of it and the content acknowledge what you don't know, what you don't understand. So I can't claim that I close the gap in understanding with perfect sympathy to all the folk who have backs against the wall. I can't claim that I understand all that's going on. So not to, with the people who are just there for the first time, or maybe in a year on Easter, don't know. But not knowing can be good seasoning, a good spice in the larger mix of a sermon, right? Sort of let that, it means you have to preach with room for people, lots of ways in for people. There has to be space in it, room to breathe, some negative space in a way. So I think that's one way for both of these questions.
Now I want to follow up Dean Smith. I like the idea of the space in preaching. Because when I first came to Canberra 6 years ago, for the first time, I was an interdenominational school because I was teaching in a denominational Episcopal school for 25 years of my career. And so I love going to Cannon Chapel because I would see so many different styles of worship and so many different styles of wonderful preaching. But one thing I have noticed is that for my Episcopal church, we have a set liturgy. Yes, we can change something, but not much. We preached to God's frozen people. We hardly see Amen or went on. You are not supposed to do that. I even did not see it in Atlanta, in all those churches with a significant number of black folks. But anyway, I want to talk about style. Because people who have their back against the wall sometimes do not need the prophet. They need really the priest or a pastor. The prophets proclaim God's justice. Well, those people who have their back against the wall, they know. They feel it. They feel it in the gut. They don't need you to remind them that the world is unfair. They need to know, what are we going to do about it? What is God doing in our midst? We need proclamation. We do not need just biblical exegesis or social analysis for that matter. They know. And that is why I so much like African American preaching. Because the preachers will lead us through a journey in the sermon. We may be feeling downtrodden, hopeless, but at the end we will say, Hallelujah.
Okay, right.
And though I may still have the back against the wall, I at least feel a sense of release. And that is what something that people come back for Palm Sunday, for Easter, to hear that. Don't give just social analysis. Move them through a journey that they have some release. God is speaking. Listen and listen again.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Oh boy.
Just to play off that a little bit, on the ride over here this morning, I was talking to my mom, and I was asking her, I was like, growing up it was hard. It was always a decision of what we were going to go without. But she would go to church every Sunday.
Yeah.
And would give God her best.
Yeah.
And so I was like, why were you dancing? Why were you shouting? Like, what was it? And she said, the only thing that I can think is, it's bad, but I could not imagine it without God.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And she said, even in the worst situations, there was something to be thankful for. And I think what becomes compelling about preaching when your back is against the wall is teaching people how to be grateful. Because you still can't make the air that you need to breathe. You still can't manufacture the water that you need to drink. You still can't fling a sun in the air that you need. And so there's a way that when you are in positions where you have nothing to lose, you recognize that you are sustained by a force that is greater than any of the oppression that you receive. And so you don't need to come to church for a deeper social. You live the burden in your body. But even as you live the burden in your body, there is a reminder that I serve a God who is able to do exceedingly abundantly above all I can think. And that testimony of how I got over, right, my soul keeps on looking back, right? Because it could have been another way. And even when it was another way, it could have been another way on that another way. So there's something that I think we've lost in our culture where we haven't cultivated deep modes of gratitude and appreciation that is not that are not as fickle as the vicissitudes of our day-to-day stock market. And maybe that leans into the kind of mysticism, right, of the tradition that I grew up in, where one tries to orient your life around a ready recognition of God's faithfulness, as opposed to sort of just tending to each of the daily problems. But when my mom said that this morning, it just really me, that she just was like, I could not imagine how hard it would be if I did not have God. So I think that there's something about preaching when the back is against the wall that reminds people that we do still have something to be thankful for.
Thank you so much. I'm hearing rattling, so I'm hoping that this means most folks are. We would really love to hear some of your questions from our panelists. Again, there's a mic on and right if you have any questions for our panelists. It is open. I do have a list of questions, y'all. Oh, do we have a brave soul? Oh, or two? Wonderful.
Hello, everyone. I had a question. What is y'all's sermon process? So when you are going to preach, what do you do? What goes into that? Obviously, there's things that happen in the moment when you get there, but what's that process look like?
Thank you. You want to jump in?
I come from a tradition that's highly biblically literate. And so, I grew up memorizing books of the Bible and doing the, sword tests and those things. And so I have a practice of trying to commit scripture to memory. So the first part of my preparation is working to do that. Now, as I've become less attached to the tradition I grew up in, my versions of memorizing the scripture are definitely not the kind of line by line, word by word. But I like to commit the text to some form of memory and ruminate with that. And so if for like a week-long process, Monday and Tuesday, I should be working on memorizing the text, reading it aloud, and sort of allowing even the language, the syntax of the text to sit with me. And that, for me, is probably more important than anything else that comes after that. Because what happens is that the text exegetes itself throughout the course of the week. The woman who I spoke with at the grocery store is doing work on the text as it does work on me. So that when I sit down to put words to a page, or ideas to a page, or when I bring questions to the interlocutors that are commentaries, it's coming from a context of having been in the world amongst the world's people. But really sitting with the text as a conversational partner is where my process, I think, is most salient.
Good afternoon. I have a question. So, bear with me. So, both were speaking about this process of understanding the gospel and speaking to those who have their back against the wall. The question is, in the African American tradition, which I come out of, I'm Pentecostal, how do we move from using that process or sharing that gospel in a less in a less rudimentary or in a less agnostic type of way, where the congregation is simply coming for a fix, if you will, every week after week, understanding, they have real life situations going on. How do you move from, that gospel rendering on Sunday to a more transformational gospel that will help your people not only deal with their problems, but of course kind of own agency in what they're going through as well? Yeah, we know Sunday after Sunday people are coming just to hear a word, but there's no transformation that may be taking place.
In that setting, is transformation taking place in the preacher?
Most likely no. Most likely no. They have a cushy job, and most likely it's a place to start.
Yeah, and that reminds me of the earlier question as well, the transformation, because I think the transformation should be happening in the preacher, and through that rumination process that you were describing, I think in the preparation, that transformation should be prior to when the person steps up, right? It's not that it can happen too, and I've seen it where the preacher's experiencing something, fairly pronounced as they're preaching. So I'm not against that, but I think that preparation should be transformational as well. But the other thing, you mentioned being Pentecostal. I come from a Latino Pentecostal background myself, and I think about in my tradition, very often the sermon, after the sermon comes an altar call. And the altar call isn't just a time to sort of come forward and be seen, but it's also a time to be ministered to. It's another form of ministry taking place at the altar. And so I think about some of those key connections that take place through altar ministry in Pentecostal settings, where relationships are forged and where there's ongoing conversation and ongoing forms of mutuality, of checking in, of following up with people, of having awareness of what the needs are, to where I'm not just going to pray for you and let you go, but you know what? I remembered what I prayed for you about. How are you doing with that next week? Right? So what type of opportunities for ongoing, and I've used the word conversation a couple times, but different forms of conversation that continue, that can be transformational, that can be opportunities for forging transformational community. And I think that's one approach that I've seen in a Pentecostal context.
Yeah, thank you very much for this question. I think this is very important. I am reminded of Karl Marx's prophetic saying, religion can be opium of the people. People may be coming for the church for a quick fix. Can I say that? And I talk about release. Release is very important to have that opportunity. Many of people who have their back against the wall did not even have any chance of that release. But then the question, that is precisely your question. After the release, what?
Yes.
Isn't it? After the worship, what is the church doing? What is the pastor leading? Jesus did not say, come and follow me and go to enjoy worship every Sunday. Jesus did not say that. Amen. Jesus said, When a brother does not have something to eat, what do you do? And answer that question honestly, that you know who Jesus really is today. After the release, what is really the question? And then how can we model in our ministry and in the work of the parish or church that you lead, that you answer honestly that question. When a or sister, a person who goes hungry tonight, what do you do? That is what God is calling us to think about. Not a quick fix, but who Jesus is today. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd like to add, particularly speaking from a Black church context and thinking about this question and watching congregations and seeing where people do show up, this is the quick fix, this is where I get it, and then I go on. And I think one of the responsibilities that we have in the Black church is to reimagine, kind of change the culture to reimagine the point of authority within the congregation and within the community, because we run to church on Sunday to hear the preacher to get a quick fix because we placed all the authority in that one sermonic moment. That's where I get the fix. And then we haven't placed sacred authority anywhere else in the life of the congregation the way that we placed it on the preaching moment. And so we've kind of created this culture that says, come and get this thing because we're not going to give it to you anywhere else. And so how do the congregations begin to reimagine how we think about where is sacred? Where is sacred ritual happening? How do we take what we get in the very important preaching moment and allow that to live through the rest of our life? How do we follow that up? What does Christian education look like in the follow-up moment from the sermon? So we're carrying forward what happens in that moment and starting to shift culturally how we're understanding the full experience of worship, but the full experience, and also the full experience of the congregational life to help get us out of that quick fix moment. It's all in the sermon. That's the only place I could get it because that's where the power rests and not anywhere else.
Do you have another question?
Does anybody else have another question? You do?
Yes.
All right, sir.
Dean Williams, you talked about this preparation, this congregational preparation, different things that you do. And I thank you for that because as I was sitting there, I was thinking about how important preaching really is. It's not something that should be taken lightly, as some may do. I went to Howard University School of Divinity, and Dr. Kenyatta Gilbert calls it congregational exegesis, right? Congregational exegesis. Are you studying, are you visiting their website, doing all of these different things before preparing to preach? So my question to the panel is, how much time should be allotted to this congregational exegesis, and what is your, I guess, preparation visiting a congregation before you preach?
So I'll just say, I don't know that there's a formula for time. I am a mother, I am a wife, I am an associate dean of worship and formation, I'm a first lady at a Baptist church, I am a preacher, right? My kids are 7 and 5. The amount of, I don't know that there's a formula of time that I actually process. But there are moments that I'm able to sit and do that exegetical work, so to speak, right, to figure out the congregation or to know. And the other piece is to know, humanity is humanity. So if I've learned some congregations, I'm pretty sure there's some similar folks in the room in another congregation. And then just figuring out when I have time to do not only the congregational exegesis, but also to do my own sermon preparation work. And that's not something that I sit and say, this week I'm going to block off Tuesday afternoon, or I'm going to do this because everything is happening all at the same time for me. So I kind of have to live in it all. And there's just, it weaves through everything that I do in my interaction, and it's always in my mind. And so every conversation, I think, Nick said it right, like texts begin to exegete themselves when you're at the grocery store. And as I'm in conversation with people, I'm thinking about something I may have read on the website. Oh, that sounds like a connection point. And I'm thinking about how the text itself that I'm sitting with for the sermon shows up and speaks in other ways. But I personally, now once upon a time I had a formula when I was single with no kids and all that, right? But since life has happened, I think the formula just figures itself out in the rhythm of life, and that changes from 1 week to another, 1 month to another. And I have had to learn how to humble myself, extremely flexible, and go with that rhythm, because my process looks different. And I couldn't be fixed and I had a really hard time, right? When we talked about like identity, even identity as a preacher, the way I prepared and the way I showed up once upon a time looks very different now. And so God and I had to do that work of like, okay, God, how do I just become okay with this new way of operating and this new rhythm and the new way you're speaking to me in my life that looks very different. And so that's why I've like thrown out the whole I need a A plus B equals C formula to prepare for a sermon and for the context in which I'm preaching, and just trust God that God's going to work that preparation in through the rhythms of my life.
We have a question to my right.
Yes. Being that we're now in this, some might say post-pandemic or extended pandemic world, and we've had a lot of conversation today about reading the room. One of the things that we learned during the pandemic was obviously reading the room is not just the visible room, but also the virtual room. What nuggets, nuances, or new practices would you all offer to those who are preaching on a weekly basis to both a visible room and a virtual room as well?
A couple of things, and this actually connects to the earlier question as well, which is if it's a new virtual room, meaning new to the preacher, or rather, let me say it this way, there are opportunities to read the room virtually, is what I was getting at, prior to entering that context. So this is something, again, I encourage for my students to check out a place before you physically go to it. I mean, the opportunities are there, right? But now in terms of when it's our space that we are engaging in, both in person, face-to-face, and virtually, I think a lot about what forms of inclusion, what strategies and opportunities for engagement are present, and what opportunities for empowering others in the community are there that the leader, the pastor, the preacher can tap into, because so often the skills are there beyond, so it shouldn't all fall on, in that case, it shouldn't all fall on the preacher. I don't think in terms of staying engaged with the virtual audience, for example, identifying, and very often it might be a younger person in the congregation that has those skills needed to maintain that line of communication, that channel of communication, so that the people that are there virtually understand that they are being seen as well. And then I think after the fact, taking the opportunity to go back and see what forms of engagement did take place. I think the preacher can do that. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I don't think that to actually find out, are there follow-up opportunities here? Because again, the preaching moment, yes, is powerful, but I think technology is allowing us to do things, is providing follow-up opportunities that perhaps we didn't have. And so I think we can take advantage of that by tapping into the platforms that are there.
Did you have a question?
First, thank you for everything that you've already shared. You mentioned being styles before. You talked about TikTok, and as you were just speaking to the platforms that are already there, I'm reflecting upon this being the 50th year of hip-hop and how that has informed my particular context and the ways in which we hear as well as the ways in which we communicate. So as you think about the things that have informed your preaching or your practice, or What are some of those areas that may not be considered religious or traditional, but how they have informed you as a communicator and how you can pass that on to us?
That's how we know it's a good question.
Since I rarely preach online, and so I can only speak from my experience of doing this Zoom teaching. And because last spring, I taught a class both for Canberra students and the community on spirituality for the contemporary world. And then we really spent time to talk about the challenges during the pandemic. I have taught that class before in person, but now I have to transpose a class that I have taught online. So I have been thinking, if I were preaching, I have not done that, online, what are some of the things that I have learned from that class? And I think relatable is still very important. But then your question prompted me to think, how do you relate virtually when you do not see people's body gesture and movement? I recall that in doing that preparation for that class, I said, can I create some experience that the body will be invited in the moments of learning? So we started each class with meditation and then conclude with either watching a short video on songs or a collective ritual. And during the class, there will be time for discussion and also for bodily movement. I taught them simple exercise of Tai Chi. What I was trying to say is, even in a Zoom or online setting, how can we invite the bodies to be present? Because without that, it's watching television, isn't it? There's no engagement, passive. We have seen numerous Zoom talk. You have a PowerPoint, then the little squares or rectangle with me, that you hardly see. And why is that relatable? That is not very relatable. Then how can we, I hope those preaching our colleagues, will help them to make sure that they invite bodily participation. They really help the students to develop skills to make it relatable, even via Zoom. This is a challenge, isn't it? Otherwise, they spend that hour watching TED Talk, not listening to you.
That's great, and I want to piggyback off of that, and I want to connect it to, you specifically mentioned hip-hop and the 50th year anniversary of that, and I think that really connects well with what you're describing, because to me, part of the genius of hip-hop and one of the reasons why it became such a powerful cultural movement, and much of this is deeply connected, I believe, to the Black church tradition. But I think that blurring the boundaries between the performer and the audience, and even if we look at the roots of hip-hop and where it developed and the context and the scenes in which it was taking root as a cultural movement, we see that it wasn't as stark of a difference. Now, granted, it grew into a multi-million-dollar industry with stars and all kinds of producers and all kinds of folks in positions of power. But at the root, it was very much an underground movement where, if we think of, for example, the format of the cipher, where people come together in a circle and share, right? Which that harkens back to much older traditions, right? But this opportunity to come together where it's not just a singular preacher or a singular performer, what does that look like where folks are, again, mutually, in a sense, bouncing off of each other, whether it's dance or rhyming or even visual graffiti or DJ, there's this energy that's being produced, and I think that there's something very much, again, tapping into my Pentecostal side, where it gives opportunity for the Spirit to move. And it's not just, the Spirit isn't just moving through one person but it's actually this mutual sharing, right? And I saw a sweatshirt over there about, I love, what is it? I love God and trap? Is that trap music? Okay. So I saw that coming in, and I was like, okay, all right, so we can love God and trap music. But again, part of the beauty of that is, and I think the beauty of that is that we recognize the giftedness that's, and I even hesitate to say from here to there, because actually we break down that boundary, right? I think there are opportunities to break down that boundary. And I don't say that to undermine the role of gifted preachers and the time and place to do that and to have a preacher, but I think that we also have to seek out those opportunities to create these holy ciphers, right, where people are coming together.
Yes. Can we give a hand to all of our wonderful panelists? I want to again thank you all. We have talked about everything from hip hop to holy ciphers to trap music to TikTok to preaching and the Holy Ghost. And so I am just so excited about this opportunity. We want you to again join us tomorrow, Thursday morning at 11:05 in Cannon Chapel. The Reverend Dr. Howard John Wesley will be preaching, and there will also be a sermon talk back. Won't you join us, meet us there? The saints would say, don't meet us there, beat us there, so that we can have a wonderful conclusion to our Bandy Preaching Conference. Thank you all and have a wonderful afternoon.
Could we thank Shanice Palmer, who did Earlier today, we had student preachers, and I want all the student preachers in the room to stand up so we can applaud their effort today. Thank you. It was important in the planning to have seasoned preachers, but also preachers that are beginning, because we know that we don't own the tradition, and we wanted you to hear different voices and different ways of planning and different rooms is the way that was created. I want to thank Ruth and her team for making sure we had something for you to eat. I want to thank the people from the Foundry that helped us with you getting registered. I want to thank Dean Love, who's been at every session back there with her mask on right there. That's Dean Love. That's Dean Love. I want to thank the alumni, out of the persons working with the alumni out of the development office and Bill's office back there. Bill's in the checkered shirt back there. I'm doing this today because I don't believe when you have a worship service you should do thank yous. So that's why I'm doing that today. I want to thank Lori for making sure that we were on point with some things we needed to do that you don't need to know about, but thank you, Lori, anyway. Laurel Hannah, who did a wonderful job with all of our graphics and making sure that you had what you needed. And I want to thank the panel who came for a sandwich to share with you today. They're very busy faculty members, but they thought it not likely to be present. And last but not least, I want to thank Ayanna Smith, who is my assistant. Tomorrow, 11:05. The dean would like you in your seats at 11 o'clock. But 11:05, and Dr. Howard John Wesley will be here, and I hope you have questions at the end of that. Thank you very much for coming today. Thank you all.